For the month of May, I've chosen to focus on warriors on the way. And so I've chosen a reading today from St. Paul from his letter to the Ephesians. And Paul very definitely is a warrior. And he talks about, what is it that warriors need to have about them? Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with readiness, so that the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all of the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. These are words inspired by God. In the summer of 1978, when I came back from Kenya on vacation, I attended a 6-week course under the Jesuits in Manresa in Dublin. And at that stage, I got introduced to the notion of working with my dreams. And so since then, I've been recording my dreams fairly frequently. And sometimes I use a technique which is called seeding the dreams, which is, as you're going to sleep at night, you think about something to which you want a kind of an alternative perspective, an alternative to the kind of waking consciousness perspective of daily life. And so I'd ask my dream life or my unconscious or my higher self to give me a kind of words of inspiration about something I'm kind of wrestling with. And I found over the years that seeding my dreams and working with the insights has been, for me personally, a source of much inspiration for my public speaking and for the books I've written. And on July 17th of last year, 2022, I had such a dream. And I've spoken about this once before. And in this dream, I'm actually in a Protestant church, and I'm listening to a young preacher giving a dynamic homily or sermon. And he's getting some pushback from the audience, actually, but I'm hugely impressed with his message. And so at the end of the service, I go around to the back door of the church. I want to kind of congratulate him. And when he comes out from the back door, I say to him, I really appreciate your message, and I really admire your courage. Myself, I'm the spiritual director for a small group called, and in the dream, for the life of me, I couldn't remember the name of Companions on the Journey. And so I find myself saying, I'm the spiritual director for a small group called Warriors on the Way. And for me, that was the birth of a whole new idea and a whole new venture as far as my kind of ministry as a priest is concerned. And that dream actually, it reactivated a very powerful vision I had actually 10 years before that, in December of 2012. I used to spend a lot of time down. There's a creek that runs down here about a mile away from me called Pena Creek. And when my dog Kayla was alive, we'd spend hours and hours trekking along the creek. And I had many very interesting astral encounters down there. So one day in December 2012, as I'm going down to the creek, I see this man sitting on the banks of the river. No, I've never met, only once ever have I met another human being down there. And so this guy is sitting on the banks of the river with his legs dangling in the water, and he's dressed in kind of dungarees, looked like a farmer, and he's chewing on a blade of grass. And I know that this is an astral being, that he's not really physically present, but that he's present astrally to me. So I sit beside him, and I dangle my feet in the water, and I pick a blade of grass, and I start chomping on the blade of grass as well. And there's no conversation. But in my mind, I say, I wonder if he's going to tell me a story. And he turned to me, and he said aloud, yes, I will tell you a story. And then he told me a long, long story, fascinating story, about the work that he does. And he told me he's been all over the cosmos looking at plantations, places in which life has been germinated, you know, by some kind of higher forces, those who give birth to life initially. And he said, I've been in many, many different places, you know, seeding life on different planets. And I see it go through the same kinds of stages every time. You know, initially it starts off with kind of single-celled creatures, and then multicellular organisms, and then we get flora, and then finally fauna of various kinds. And then at some stage, when a creation reaches the place where beings become self-aware and they're utilizing free will, at that stage, he said, I cannot predict how it's going to go on from there. Up to then, I can predict exactly what the stage is going to be, but at that stage, I can never predict how it's going to work out. Because when you build self-awareness into it, when it reaches self-awareness, and when it reaches the stage of free will, the ability to make choices, some civilizations are going to totally destroy themselves, and other civilizations are going to ascend into a kind of a Christ consciousness. So he said to me, your civilization on this planet right now, what you call Homo sapiens sapiens, is at a trifurcation point, not just a bifurcation point, but a trifurcation point. It's separating into three possible different groups. And he called them, he said, the first group I'm going to call Homo Sociopathicus. And it is those people who are dedicated to war and to chaos and to total control of all the resources on the planet, including control over the other denizens, even human denizens of the planet. And he called that group Homo Sociopathicus. And the second group he called Homo Artificialis. And he said, these are the cowardly, these are the sheep-like beings who will be turned by technology and by Homo Sociopathicus into mindless robots, programmed and hacked into total compliance. That's the second group. And the third group he called Homo Spiritualis, those awakened souls who refuse to be hacked and who oppose Homo Sociopathicus and identify instead with their true God nature. And I believe that it is from this third group that Warriors on the Way is born. And so as a result of that vision of 2012 and of the 2022 dream, I wrote a manifesto about what I think, you know, Homo Spiritualis would look like. And I've read this to you once before. I'm going to repeat it today. We are in a battle for the soul of the planet. And so God is sending in the warriors and the light bringers, whose mission is to take education away from the child molesters, to take economics away from the banksters, to take healing away from big pharma, to take storytelling away from the mass media, to take entertainment away from Hollywood, to take food production away from agribusiness, to take fire away from the military-industrial complex, to take democracy away from the politicians, and to take spirituality away from Mecca and from Rome. So for me, this is, you know, the vision I have as I move forward in my kind of missionary career now in California, as a priest in California. And so I want to look at then at the notion of warriorhood. And I want to try to clear up some kind of misunderstandings, because there's a misunderstood and there's even an abused warriorhood. So in the past, I believe many warriors have been corrupted. Their idealism as warriors has been channeled into gratuitous violence and in the service of some kind of a colonial agenda. So warriorhood has been misunderstood or even abused, or the warriors themselves even abused. And so even in bands of allegedly religious warriors, those who kind of take up the sword, you know, on behalf of religion or spirituality, even those, it can be inverted. This spiritual vocation can be inverted. And you get these people throughout, for instance, Christian history, getting involved in inquisitions against their own people, literally tearing other Christians limb from limb, or in crusades against the perceived, the outsiders. So warriorhood can be corrupted and inverted. And the reason for this is we know from psychology that about 1% of the population are literally born psychopathic. Psychopaths are born, they're about 1% of the population. And there's a significant difference in psychology between a psychopath and a sociopath. A psychopath, as I say, is actually born into it. And I had the devastating, opportunity at one stage to be trying to treat a psychopath in my psychology practice. Now, sociopaths are very different. Sociopaths are born as normal people, but they're subsequently molded either by circumstances or by training into a kind of a soulless savagery. But given their own devices and being in real environment, loving environments, they do not develop, sociopathy. And so they have to be groomed and molded into this. And so what happens throughout human history is that you get psychopathic leaders who have created, I'm going to call them boot camps, to turn God-fearing and patriotic people into monsters. And it's a two-phase process. The first thing is you have to dehumanize the enemy. And then secondly, you have to dehumanize the naive recruits and turn them into obedient killing machines. And we see this in the armies of the world. We take, ordinary people who are patriotic and want to kind of defend their own country, and we see them being turned in boot camps by the psychopaths in charge into kind of obedient, sociopathic killing machines themselves. And when I look at the world around me, I see that although psychopaths represent just 1% of the population, they are definitely overrepresented in the military, in banking, in CEOs of great outfits, among politicians, and I believe in the upper echelons of the clergy. When you get high enough up in the hierarchy, you're encountering psychopathic behavior very often in religion. And then these leaders, they guide the lower ranks into sociopathy as their life work. So they're going to take ordinary citizens or ordinary, people in the pews and try to turn them in their work life into sociopaths who will do their bidding. Now, among what I would call the intentionally divided masses, this can take the form of what I call debate by slogan, which is basically a modern form of xenophobia. And so you get people just throwing these slogans without ever thinking what they mean, or with no evidence to back it up, or no data to support it, but just calling somebody a racist, or white supremacy, or toxic masculinity, or anti-vaxxer, or conspiracy theorist. All you have to do is throw out these slogans, and then you don't have to examine the data or actually be in dialogue with people who have alternative perspectives. This is the modern version of the old religious slogans like Gentiles or infidels or pagans, where the in-group regard the entire world as broken up into just two camps, us and them, and they're always the bad guys. And so they're Gentiles, or they're infidels, or they're pagans, but they certainly are not us. And so for very, very often, the people in the pews or the people on their TV couches are brainwashed with a slew of philosophically fallacious retorts, like argumentum ad hominem, attacks on the person, not on the message, or reductio ad absurdum, taking somebody else's point and reducing it to an absurd version of it, and then taking issue with this straw man, or this notion of what's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. B followed after A, therefore A must have caused B. This kind of simplistic thinking. Now, none of this, however, is what real warriors do. So let me talk about real warriors for a few minutes. A healthy immune system must be able to identify an enemy and to neutralize it. And we call these warrior cells, biochemically we call them macrophages. And without them, the body would very, very quickly be overcome by the invaders. So our very physical body depends on the ability of the body itself to both identify and to neutralize, any kind of attacking mechanism. And they're called macrophages when we're talking about biologically. But this is true not just biologically at the individual human level, where your body is fighting off various kinds of invaders, neutralizing them, but it's true sociologically in the group. That there are people within the group who are acting as a virus, for the group. And even religiously at a global level, that there are movements on a global level which are literally acting as a virus at a spiritual and a psychological and religious level. Now, I had another dream just a few months ago where I was asking a kind of input on this issue. And so I seeded my dream before I went to bed. And I asked for, I want to be able to distinguish the difference between sin on the one hand and evil on the other hand. And here's the download I got. I woke up with this phrase burned in my psyche. And it said, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept, whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So there's a huge difference there. Sin is basically just an individual person, transgressing what is basically just a culturally created precept. It's a man-made law. So sin is where you transgress against a human precept. You break some kind of a human law. That's very, very different from evil. What evil is, I believe, at a cosmic level, a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. The entire agenda is to separate souls from source. Now, in the past, unfortunately, warriors were being tasked with punishing individual sinners, burning them at the stake, or killing people in crusades. So the warriors went out in order to punish individual sinners for breaking man-made laws. But that is not the mission of the real warrior. The real warrior, the true function of the real warrior, is to identify the virus of alien ideologies that pervert human institutions to advance an agenda of godlessness. That is the warrior of our time. And that is the true function of the warrior, to be able to identify these alien ideologies which are perverting human institutions in order to advance an agenda of godlessness, of separating souls from source. And this happens again and again and again in human history, in the great movements and the great breakthroughs. In my opinion, Judaism needed a Jesus to liberate religion from the tyranny of legalism. I believe that India needed a Mahatma Gandhi in order to liberate the subcontinent from the domination of British colonialism and also for the further oppression of its own internal caste system. Gandhi was killed by a Brahmin priest because Gandhi, not only was he trying to get rid of the British colonialists, he was trying to get rid of the caste system, which had created these four hugely different groups within India. And he was killed by a Brahmin priest because of that. South Africa, I believe, needed a Nelson in order to end apartheid. And the USA of the 1960s needed a Martin Luther King Jr. in order to liberate our country from systemic racism. So these were all warriors who spoke truth to power. And three of them paid the ultimate price with their own lives. Now, I believe it is not a coincidence that all four of these people I've mentioned were deeply compassionate men. But they realized, as I've said many, many times to you, there are four very different kinds of faces of compassion. The first face of compassion is compassion as confirmation. The attaboy, you're doing a great job, keep it up, where we encourage each other. That's one form of compassion. I call it compassion by confirmation. A second kind of compassion I call the compassion of cooperation, because we're all members of a team and each of us must play our assigned role. When we volunteered for incarnation, we volunteered to be here and to be here now. And each of us has an assigned role. We signed up to play a part on this team of Homo sapiens as we move into what I call Homo Christus. So that's the second kind of compassion, the compassion as cooperation. The third kind of compassion, I would say, is the compassion of compensation. When you have to pivot in order to make up for the mistake of a team member. We're all, human, we're all fragile. We all drop the ball. And so occasionally somebody else has to help us out by picking up the ball to make sure that there's not, a turnover, and that the ball doesn't get into the hands of the enemy team. And so sometimes compassion is compensation for the mistakes that others make. And then fourthly, I believe there's the compassion of confrontation. It's when you speak truth to power and say no to tyranny, that this is a hugely important form of compassion as well. And this was, in my opinion, Jesus and Gandhi and Mandela and King were fluent in all forms of this compassion. When it was appropriate, they took each of the four forms and articulated and stood up for it. And so I believe then that there is a time for triggering. A leader will occasionally have to trigger those whom he is intending to lead. Now, there's a difference then. So a leader who constantly triggers everybody is a very poor leader. But a leader who never triggers anybody is even a worse leader, preaching just predigested, bland pablum that neither upsets anybody nor inspires anybody, but simply allows the group to stew in its soul-sucking mediocrity. A true warrior leader must be able to stretch us out of our comfort zone. And that's exactly what Thomas says in the Gnostic Gospel. The third stage of the search is being upset, being in the search, being upset by what we find. We must be triggered in our search in order to reach beyond where we currently are. Now, those people who try to keep a very low profile and who attempt to kind of avoid detection by living under the radar are very soon going to find themselves living under the jackboot. This happens again and again and again in human history, that the ones who try to stay kind of faceless and nameless and live under the radar finally find themselves living under tyranny. And so I believe that the fear-filled silent majority are like a leg-manacle holding the children of God in perpetual bondage to the power-hungry masters of darkness. So this is the time for the warriors. To be spiritual means to wake up, and it means to speak up. Otherwise, you could be religious, but you're not spiritual. To be really spiritual means you have to really wake up to the reality and speak up for the truth. I've spoken before about, a 92-year-old rabbi whom I know of, was a good friend of my friend Arlen Brownstein. And this rabbi spent 3 years as a young teenager hiding and surviving in the forests of Poland after most of his family had been captured and sent off to Auschwitz. He survived gratefully. He's 92, 93 years old at this stage. And he's written several books. But one is his account of that time living in the forest as like an 11-year-old boy. So he's written about those times. And he said that his anger is not so much against the Nazis who perpetrated the crimes, nor is it against the Christian neighbors who sold them out to the Nazis. His anger against the rabbis of his time who failed to alert them and organize some kind of a resistance plan. And so I say again today that I don't want anybody in the future to look back and say, Sean was supposed to be a spiritual director. Why didn't he warn us? I must say.